Hi, welcome back to the PhotoshopTrainingChannel.com. I'm Jesus Ramirez. In this tutorial, I'm going to show you how to create a realistic Chrom 3D effect in Photoshop. We're going to use Photoshop's 3D features to achieve this effect. By the way, this is an update to an older 3D text tutorial. In the latest Photoshop release, Adobe changed how Photoshop handles materials, which is what creates the effect that we're making today. So if you watch an older Photoshop tutorial, the sliders and controls will not be the same. This is the perfect tutorial for you to watch if you're brand new to Photoshop 3D or if you're coming from another tutorial that confused you with the different controls. The reason that things have changed is that Photoshop is now using Adobe Standard Materials, ASM, which is a standardized material template defined in NVIDIA's Material Definition Language, MDL. And it adheres to the PBR metal roughness workflow. PBR stands for physically based rendering. If you don't understand any of what I just said, no problem. You don't have to know any of this technical stuff. Simply put, Photoshop now uses a material system that more closely matches other Adobe 3D apps like Adobe Dimension and Adobe Aero. And to make something reflective, you now need a combination of low roughness and high metallic values. Again, don't worry if you think all this sounds confusing or if you think that you're not good at Photoshop 3D. In this tutorial, I'm gonna go very slow and I divided up everything into small digestible chunks so that you can follow along. Why don't we just jump right into the tutorial? This is the image that I'm going to work with. If you want to follow along, you can download this file. I'll place a link down below in the description. The first step is to get the background ready so that we can put in the 3D text. And I'm just going to do a couple of adjustments to refine this image. I'm just going to right click on the layer and convert it into a smart object so that we can work with it non-destructively. With a smart object, we can apply editable adjustments, distortions, filters, and transformations. I'm gonna go into Filter, Camera, Raw, Filter. And from here, the first thing that I'll do is adjust the perspective of this image. There's some weird perspective going on that I'm not liking very much. So I'm going to quickly fix it by going into the transform tool. And from here, all I'm going to do is click on the A for the auto upright. And Photoshop will analyze the lines in the photo and it will straighten them out. This is the before and the after. And I think that this looks much better. Next, I'm going to go back into the basic panel where I can continue adjusting the image, and I'm just going to make a few adjustments to enhance it. I'm going to increase the contrast. I'm also going to add a little bit of texture and vibrance to make those colors pop a bit more. Vibrance is a smart way of adding saturation. It protects already saturated pixels and skin tones. I'm also going to go into the split toning tab, and from here I'm going to shift the hues of the shadows. In other words, I'm going to apply a color to the shadows. So I'm going to select a color like this one here. It's a cyan bluish color, and I'm going to increase the saturation like so. Just a subtle adjustment, as you can see there. And I'm also going to go into the calibration tab and I can adjust the red, green, and blue primaries. Notice that if I drag this red hue slider to the right, the yellows get yellower. And if I drag it to the left, they get more orange and then eventually magenta. So in this case, I don't want the image to have too much yellow. I want it to be more in the oranges like so. And I can do the same thing. I can drag the greens to the right so that it removes some of the yellow that you see on this side. I think that's a bit too much, so maybe right about here. If I go all the way to the left, it brings more of that yellow back, and that's not something that I want. I want to stay with the oranges and with the blues. And I can also shift the hue for the blues as well. In this case, I think we were okay right at 0. I might increase the saturation just a bit more. And I'll also increase the saturation of the reds a little bit so that the reds look more orange. Before and after. It's a subtle adjustment, but I think it works, and I don't mind the magentas back here. That's fine. I'll press OK, and now we can work with blurring the background. I want the focus to be in the 3D text, so I want a blurry background. Then one of the easiest ways of blurring the background is by going into Filter, Blur Gallery, and selecting Tilt Shift. And the way that this filter works is by blurring the image completely past this dashed line up and this bottom dashed line down. So everything below this line or above this line is completely blurry. And from the dashed line to the solid line is a gradual blur. Same thing here at the bottom. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to click and drag this bottom dashed line up like so, and then click and drag this down right about here. I want the focus to be more or less in this area. So I'm going to drag these lines so that the focus is right about here. And I'm going to drag this one down as well, like so. So the background is blurry and this bottom part is in focus, which is where the 3D text will stand. And if you want to, you can adjust the blur. You can make it blurrier, less blurry. You can also increase the light bokeh if you want to get a bokeh effect in your image. Totally up to you. In this image, I don't think I need to do too much of that. I'm just going to blur it so that I lose all the details in the background. And I'm going to click and drag this down even further, actually, maybe right about here, and drag this one up. Then I'll press OK. So this is the background that we will work with. I'll click on this arrow to collapse the smart filter so that we have more room to work with. What I'm going to do now is select the horizontal type tool, and I'm just going to type on my image. And I'm using the Franklin Gothic Heavy font. And I'm just going to click and type the word 3D. And I know it's very, very small. And what I'll do is I'll simply select the move tool and I'll click and drag on a corner handle to scale that up. I know that in another tutorial I mentioned that it was not a good idea to scale a text layer the way that I'm doing. Since I'm not working with character styles, it's really not a big deal. So it's okay to scale in this case. If you don't know what I'm talking about, check out the link below in the description. I talk about the glitch that Photoshop has when you scale text and you work with paragraph styles and character styles. But anyway, I'm going to click and drag this down and place it right about here. Then I'll click on the check mark to commit the changes. What I'll do now is convert this text layer into a 3D layer. You can do so in several ways. You can go into 3D and select New Extrusion from Selected Layer, and Photoshop will extrude the 3D text. Extrusions are the primary method of creating 3D objects in Photoshop. You can take a 2D shape and push it back into the Z-axis to create a 3D object. It's a lot like pushing Play-Doh through a dough cutter. Now, before we do anything else, we need to match the perspective so that the 3D text looks like it's sitting on this ground, on the street. One of the best ways of doing so is by following the parallel converging lines on your image and see where they lead. And you can see all these different parallel converging lines, and you can see that they all reach a point right about here. Now, you don't have to be perfect, but you have to get it close enough. And another way of thinking about it is, where does the ground meet the sky? So imagine that there were no buildings on the street and we have the ground. Where would it meet the sky? It's probably right about here somewhere. Again, I don't have to be perfect, but with experience, I can tell you that's what it is. And if you really want to find out, what you need to do is select the line tool and make sure that you have a stroke that is visible. And then just click and drag and follow all the parallel converging lines of this image and see more or less where they meet. And I was very, very close with that line. You can see that from this point, I can now follow all the lines in the scene. See that? See how all these lines are meeting at that point. So with experience, you can just give it a very good guess like I did there. I wasn't perfect, but I was close enough that it wouldn't matter. I'll delete these shape layers because we don't need them anymore. I was just using them as a visual representation to follow the parallel converging lines to find the vanishing point and the horizon line. But anyway, when you get to that point, that will be the vanishing point, and that's where you can set a guide so that you know more or less where to apply your ground plane. Now, let me enable this 3D layer, and I can double click on it to go into the 3D layer. And from here, I can select the move tool so that I can see the 3D components of the image. If you don't see the 3D elements, that's because you don't have the move tool selected. So for example, if you had the rectangular marquee tool selected, you wouldn't see any of those 3D elements. But if you select the move tool, you will. And one thing that I like to do is to use my left hand to hold the V key for the move tool and the M key for the rectangular marquee tool, so I can quickly switch between either or as I'm working in 3D. I'm right-handed, so I'm using my left hand to control the keyboard shortcuts. If you're left-handed, then you can use your right hand. The point is that you can quickly enable and disable the 3D elements by using these two keyboard shortcuts. But anyway, with the move tool selected, you can see the ground plane, the grid where the 3D text is sitting. And this grid is very important. Photoshop automatically generates this grid and it helps you catch shadows and reflections, but the grid does not save on your final image. The center is the cross section between the x-axis, which is width, and the z-axis, which is depth. The y-axis, which is height, is not represented. I now have to match this grid onto the street so that the 3D text looks like it's sitting on that street. And if you notice, there's this gray line back here. You see that line? That line is the horizon line of the 3D scene. So I gotta match this horizon line onto the horizon line of the image. So I can use the tools here in the bottom left to move the camera. I'm not moving the 3D object, I'm moving the camera. One way of thinking about the camera is to think about the camera as your eyes. So if we were standing on the street, we could walk around the 3D element, but the 3D element wouldn't move, only our eyes. So we're moving, so that's what we're doing. We're moving ourselves around in the 3D scene. So you can click and drag on the orbit tool to rotate around the 3D scene. See that? The 3D text is not moving, we're moving around it. And if you move it a lot and you don't know where you end up, you can always click on default camera and come right back. So what I'm going to do is click and drag down to try to match those lines. And if it's hard to click and drag, what you can also do is go into the properties panel and then click on the coordinates icon. And from here, you can use these controls to adjust the camera. See that? I can push back and forward on the camera, down or up, and left and right. I could also use this slider to control the rotation of the camera. I don't want to do that, so I'm going to click on this icon to reset it. And what I'm going to do is bring it way down. See that? Now I can match those two lines like so. And notice that as soon as I match those lines, the 3D text looks like it's sitting on this ground plane. So now I can continue using these adjustments. See that? See, I can bring it up or down to match it a little bit better. Left and right, like so. And I can zoom in like so. And you'll know that you got the perspective right, because if you move in the z-axis, it'll look like it's going up and down the street. Also, something very important, once you match the perspective of your scene, what you want to do is make sure that you save this camera view so that we can always come back to it. And the way that you would do that is by going onto this little camera icon, the 3D camera, under View, make sure that you select Save. Then give this view a name, and I'm just going to call it Final View and press OK. And the reason that you want to do that is that if you accidentally move the camera, it'll be very difficult to get it back where you had it. But now that we saved it, all we need to do is simply click on Default Camera, and it comes back into the default view. Or even better, we can click on the Final View, which is the one we created, and it brings it back down to the camera view that we saved. So really cool stuff. Now that we've matched the 3D scene's horizon line to the horizon line in the background, we no longer need the guide. So I'm going to hide it by pressing Control semicolon on Windows. That's Command semicolon on the Mac. But anyway, now that we have our 3D text in the street, we can now work with the actual 3D text. So when I click on it, you'll see the control handles here. There's a green one, a red one, and a blue one. The green one controls the y-axis, the red one controls the x-axis, and the blue one controls the z-axis. The little tip on the top controls the movement, the positioning. The little arc next to it controls the rotation. And the cube controls the scale in that axis. I'm going to press Control Z on Windows, Command Z in the Mac several times to undo. And I want to talk about one other handle, which is the big cube here. You can scale uniformly with that particular handle. So you can make your 3D text bigger. And if you want to make sure that it's sitting on the ground plane, what you need to do is click on this icon, on the coordinates icon, and then click on move to ground, and it will push it up to make sure that you are sitting on the ground plane. And the reason that you want your 3D object sitting on the ground plane is because there is a 3D light that you can adjust, and the light creates a shadow, and you want the shadow to be on the ground plane. And also we're gonna add a reflection a little later on. But anyway, now that we've set this up, now let's work with the 3D panel. In the 3D panel, you'll see your 3D text here, and you will see the materials that make up this 3D object. A material creates the visual appearance of a 3D object's surface. And this is what changed in Photoshop 2020. Photoshop now uses Adobe standard materials, which more closely resemble Adobe Dimension, Project Arrow, Adobe Stock 3D, and Adobe Capture. So if you're in an older version of Photoshop, the sliders that control the materials will look different. When you click on a material, the corresponding part in the 3D object will light up. And you can change the color if you like to really see which area of the 3D object we're affecting. In this case, it's the front, but we also have an extrusion material, which would be the inside. Let me select a different color, like yellow. Press OK, and you can see how that affected that area. But anyway, we don't need to worry about that. What I'm going to do is select the top material, hold shift, and select the bottom material. And I'm just going to make all a darker shade of gray. Now, you don't want to go all the way to black. If you've seen my old tutorial, I gave the instruction to go all the way to black, and that was okay in older versions of Photoshop. But in Photoshop 2020, you don't want to do that, and I'll show you why a little later on, but it has to do with the reflections that we're about to create. So a lot of things change in Photoshop 2020, and this is one of the things you need to watch out for. But anyway, I'm just going to make it a dark shade of gray. So all the faces of my 3D object are now a dark shade of gray. I'm also going to click on this 3D text layer, and under shape preset, I'm going to select this one here, the one called inflate, and that's going to give us this roundness, which will pick up the reflections much, much better. Also, there's two things in this panel that I want to point out. We're not going to go into them just for the sake of time, but I want you to be aware of them. First of all, the extrusion depth slider. This slider helps you control the 3D model's thickness, and the edit source button. This button allows you to edit the text, so you can change the text to something else if you want to. What I'm going to do now is work on the reflection. To do that, I'm going to go into the layers panel, and on my background layer, I'm just going to press Ctrl A on Windows, Command A on the Mac to make a selection around the canvas, and then I'm just going to copy these pixels. Ctrl C on Windows, Command C on the Mac. Then I'm going to double click on my 3D layer to go into the 3D panel, and from here I'm going to click on environment, and under environment we have something called an IBL, an image based light. It's a light based on an image, and by default you get this little image here. It's basically a gray image with these little circles, and if I click and drag on this sphere, you can see how the reflection of those circles appears on the 3D object. See that? So what we're going to do now is use the image of the background to reflect on our 3D image instead of that default IBL. So to do so, again, go into environment, make sure that IBL is checked, and click on this icon and select new texture and press OK. Photoshop will then create a completely white IBL, but we're going to edit that. And you can edit it by going into this icon and selecting edit texture. From here, all you need to do is press Ctrl V on Windows, Command V on the Mac to paste that image. Obviously, the image is much larger than the canvas that I made, so what I can do is simply reveal all the hidden pixels. And to do that, you can go into Image, Reveal All, and Photoshop will make the canvas as big as it has to be to make sure that all the pixels that you have are showing. I'll double click on the hand tool to fit the image to the screen, and you can see that we have the entire image. All I'm going to do now is close this IBL and save it, press OK, and now Photoshop is catching the reflections of that IBL on the 3D text layer. And I'm going to press Ctrl D on Windows, Command D on the Mac to deselect. Then I'll press the V key to enable the Move tool. And now I can click and drag on this sphere to rotate my IBL, and you can see how that affects that 3D layer. If at this point you really can't see the reflection, that's because the materials are not really reflective. Let me show you how to make them more reflective. I'm going to select the front inflation material, hold shift and click on the bottom one, the back inflation material, to select them all. And I'm going to make sure that metallic is set all the way to 100% to make it more reflective. And this is one of the things that changed in the new version of Photoshop. It is now called metallic. It used to be reflection. So this is why some of those older tutorials are harder to follow, because the sliders have different names and they do slightly different things. Also, if you're at this point and you're having a lot of trouble seeing the reflections, that might be because your materials are too dark. If I set them to black, notice that I really can't see the reflections. This is why, if you follow my old tutorials or many people's old tutorials, you'll probably get stuck, because before you could set everything to black and you would still see the reflection. Now you can't see it in the preview. You'll be able to see it in the render, but not the preview. So it makes it harder to work. So maybe you can make the gray a little bit brighter so that you could see what it looks like, and then just make it dark later if you need to. So I'll press OK for now so that we can see the reflection. And then under environment, I'm just going to click and drag and find an area that is appropriate for my scene. So this is totally up to you. It's all subjective. Obviously, the 3D object is reflecting the background. It's not necessarily realistic because I would need to reflect the other side, which we don't have, but this will be good enough. So I'm just going to select something that looks cool, maybe something like this. And what I can do now is press the M key to select the rectangular marquee tool, and I can click and drag to make a selection. And once I make a selection, I can click on this icon to render the image. Rendering simply means that Photoshop is going to do all the calculations to apply the lighting, the shadows, the reflections, and everything. Clearly, this is way too bright, so I'll cancel the render by pressing the escape key on the keyboard, and I'll go back into the materials. Select the top one, select the bottom one by holding shift as I click on both, and make my base color almost black. I'll press OK, and then I'll click on the render button once again. And as you can see, that makes it just a little bit darker. Also, you'll notice that the reflection is not really quite reflective yet, and the reason is that we have the roughness set to 33%. So I'm going to press the escape key to cancel the render, and when you press escape, you simply cancel the render. And I'm just going to bring the roughness down to 0, and I'm going to click on the render button once again. And notice that when it starts rendering, the reflections on the 3D object are way more reflective, and that's what we want. That's the secret for creating reflective surfaces in Photoshop materials: a high value for the metallic property and a low value for the roughness property. And if you're unhappy with the reflections, what you can do is press the escape key once again, go into environment, make sure that you select the move tool. Again, I have my left hand in the V and M key, so I'm going to tap V, and I'll click and drag to rotate the 3D object. And I think I made the 3D text a little too dark to see how the reflection is going to affect it, so I may need to brighten it up and then make it dark again when I'm done. Yeah, I'm not very happy with that, so what I'll do is I'll just rotate it a bit more until I find another area that I like. Let me try that, and I'll click on render. And I think that this is going to work much, much better. And this looks pretty good. I'm going to press the escape key, and we're going to work on a few other things. Number one is I'm going to work on the shadow color. So remember earlier I showed you the infinite light. I can click and drag on this light, and you can see how there's a shadow here at the bottom. So you have to make sure that the infinite light is pointing the way that the light in the scene is pointing so that you can get accurate shadows. In this case, the best lighting will probably be something like this. It looks like this might be a backlit scene where the background is brighter. So then we're gonna have the shadow coming in front of the 3D text layer. So let's try that. I'll click on render and see how this looks. I think that this looks pretty good. What I'll do now is make the shadows a different color. To change the color of your shadows, you can go under environment and you'll see the ground plane options. You can see the color for the shadows here. When you click on the color, this color picker comes up, and you can just click anywhere on your scene to set a color. So I'm just going to select one of these darker greens. That way my shadow matches the colors of the scene. I'll press OK. And now my shadow will be that color. Also, notice that the reflections are set to 0. So I'm going to increase it and set it to maybe 74 and bring the roughness down a little bit and then click on render. That way we have reflections on the ground plane. And you can start seeing what the reflections look like. If it helps, you can press the escape key, then hit the M key again for the rectangular marquee tool and just make a selection at the bottom and then click on render so that we can just get a preview of what the reflections look like, and you can keep adjusting them accordingly. So what I'll do now is press escape and probably increase the opacity a little bit and bring the roughness down even more, and I'll click on render. Working with 3D involves a lot of fine tuning, so you will have to keep rendering and seeing your results. For the sake of time, we're just going to call this good and we're going to move on into the next step. So I'll press the escape key to stop the render, and I'm going to show you a cool trick. If you select your 3D text layer, you can go into the 3D menu and select split extrusion, press OK, and Photoshop will split the 3D object into 2. By the way, after doing this, the text will not be editable anymore. And for some reason, Photoshop sent the D way off to the side. So we can bring it back. I have the move tool active, and when I click on the 3D object, you'll see the 3D widget, and I can click on the red one and move it to the left. Also, you can select the 3D model by clicking on the D here in the 3D panel. Then go into the Properties tab and click on Move to Ground, and it will place it in the ground plane, and you can move it forward by clicking and dragging on the Z axis like so. So you just gotta put it back into place. And if you really can't tell where it was, you can always click and drag on the Orbit tool and then place it according. And it looks like it also got a little bit smaller, and that's okay. We can make it bigger. I'm gonna try to get it in place there, and then come back around and click on this cube to scale it up. Click on Move to Ground so it moves up. And as long as they're close in size, I'll be happy because they don't need to be exactly the same size, but it looks like I'm still just a little bit smaller. So I'm gonna go just a tiny bit bigger, like so. And then I'm gonna go into my 3D panel here and make sure that I click on the final view camera, click on the D and move it to the side, maybe rotate it a little bit like so. And I can select the 3 and also rotate it, but I'll rotate it the opposite way. And I can move it anywhere that I want, like so. I'll select them both and click on Move to Ground to make sure that they're both sitting on the ground plane. The next step is to make sure that everything is rendered. So I'm just gonna make sure that there are no selections. To double check, I'll just press Control D on Windows, Command D on the Mac, and I'm going to click on the render button, and this will render my entire image. Now, the amount of time that your computer will take rendering this 3D scene will depend on the processing power that you have on your video card. So it could be really slow if you're on a laptop. If you're on a desktop with a powerful video card, a powerful processor, then it will be a lot faster. It all depends. So what I'm gonna do now is pause the video and let this render out, and I'll come back to you as soon as it's rendered. Okay, my 3D object is finished rendering and it's time to move on to the next step. I'm gonna go into the Layers panel, and now I can adjust this 3D layer accordingly. What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna select this 3D layer and I'm just gonna copy it. Edit, copy, merge, and then I'm gonna paste it in place. And the reason that I'm doing this is so that I don't accidentally adjust the 3D layer, and I can just work with a pixel-based version of what I had, and I can enable the background. What I can do now is adjust the layer accordingly. For example, I can create a layer mask, then select the brush tool and paint with black and hide the reflection even more if need be. And just like with any other composite, we need to make sure that the brightness of both the background and the foreground match. To adjust the brightness of a layer, you can use a levels adjustment layer. Go into the new adjustment layer icon and select levels. Then you can click on this icon to clip the levels adjustment layer to the layer below. That way we only affect the 3D layer and nothing else. And we can use this center point to adjust the contrast of the image. If you're having trouble visualizing what I'm talking about, what you can do is create a black and white adjustment layer so that you strip out the color of the image and you can better see the brightness in the composite. See how the 3D image is just a little too bright here, so I'm just darkening it up so that it matches the overall composite a little bit better. And I'm going to click and drag the black and white adjustment layer into the trash icon to delete it since I don't need it anymore. It was just a visual aid to help us match the brightness of the foreground and background. And obviously you can spend a lot more time adjusting highlights and things like that. For example, one thing that you can do is create a new layer. Also clip it to the layer below. Control-Alt-G on Windows, Command-Option-G on the Mac is the keyboard shortcut. And you can simply paint with white on the side of the 3D object. Then you can double click to the side of the layer. And I'm going to move my layer style window to the left so that we can see what we're going to do here. And I'm just going to change the blending mode to color dodge and uncheck the transparency shapes layers checkbox so that you can see how that creates that strong highlight there on the right. And the reason that I'm doing that is just so that I match the brighter side here on the right. So you can keep making these type of highlights around your image if you need to. I'm still painting on that layer. It's totally up to you how you want to create those highlights. So that's before and after. What I'm going to do now is take all these layers and I'm going to put them into a smart object. So I'm going to select the layer on top, hold shift, click on the layer on the bottom, right click and convert it into a smart object. Then I'm going to go into filter, camera raw filter and treat this as a single image. And I can adjust the temperature, maybe make it a little bit cooler, give it more contrast, and also go into the texture slider to make the texture of the image pop, increase the clarity, which is contrast in the midtones, increase the vibrance, which is a smart way of adding saturation. It protects already saturated pixels in skin tones. I can also go into the effects icon and I'm going to add a little bit of grain. I blur the background, as you can see, and also the 3D element is very smooth. So I don't necessarily like that. As I said in other tutorials, to me that feels very computer generated. So I like to add just a little bit of grain to make it feel more like an actual photograph. Then I'm going to fit the image to screen and I'm going to finalize the effect by adding a vignette, but I'm also going to increase the highlights so that the highlights pop through. I think this may be a little dark, so I'm going to reduce the vignette just a tiny bit, like so. Then I'll press OK. So this is before the camera raw adjustment and this is after. As always, if you enjoy this technique, make sure that you click on that like button now. And if you decide to try out this technique, make sure that you upload your results into Instagram. I would love to see what you come up with. Remember to use the hashtag PTCVids. Also, if this is your first time at the Photoshop training channel, don't forget to click on that subscribe and notification buttons. Thank you so much for watching. I will talk to you again in the next Photoshop tutorial.